Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Nice to see so many of you out of bed this morning, and none of you armed. What's the purpose of today? Well, from my perspective, this is about starting a discussion, not concluding anything, starting a discussion. And I want to talk about why this discussion should occur and why it matters. And I think there are 4 reasons why we need to have a discussion. And the first of those is, and this I hope is common ground, that we all see the world changing around us, and perhaps against us. And there are some who argue that what we're seeing in our world today is just a blip in the otherwise guaranteed historical passage of a Western-dominated world that we've known since perhaps the 19th century. And others will argue, no, we're at an inflection point where the world that we have known for so long is changing, and changing in ways that will bring new threats and risks to our safety, our security, and our prosperity. And therefore, there are implications in this, I think, either way, whether you're dealing with a blip or whether you're dealing with a strategic inflection point. But it does seem to me that, as a group, we might question the assumptions that perhaps we have taken as somehow unquestionable about how the world operates. So we see perhaps the US taking a different approach now and after the election in November to how it takes its place in the world. We see institutions that we have invested in, grown up with and relied on, but have sprung really from the end of the Second World. So UN, European Union, IMF, World Bank, now being challenged by other institutions which have a different perspective. We see countries like China and due course perhaps even India beginning to stretch their legs in our world, where we're used to those countries, particularly China, taking a very non-interventionist stance. And that clearly reflects that we all live in the Asian century, where wealth and power over this century is moving east, where 69% of global GDP already is. We see a different relationship with Russia. We see something of a dialogue of the deaf, I think, with Russia, but where we in the West are being challenged by a Russian perspective, whether that's in Syria or Crimea, Ukraine, or Georgia, or Baltics, and on the issue of NATO. So perhaps the rules-based international order which we rely on to be secure and trade is being questioned, and other people may have ideas about a different sort of rules-based international order. The second assumption I think we must challenge, particularly those who are in defense and security, is we've all grown up with a homeland that's secure. And so many of the things that we have done over the last 20, 30 years, the interventions in the Balkans, in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, at no stage in those interventions have we worried about the safety and security of our homeland. And it has fed this sense of Europe somehow having grown out of conflict, that Europe is post-conflict, and war only occurs abroad, and only occurs on terms established by the West. That doesn't feel like the things that we are looking at now. But on the basis of that assumption, certainly since the end of the Cold War, we have clearly been able to, for very good reasons, relax aspects of our defense scale, readiness, planning, and we've been able to spend our money on other things. And there was a letter in the Times this morning from Julian Lewis which makes that point. That's a really good thing. And obviously we would love the future to be similarly benign, but what I think we need to discuss is, can we guarantee the future is going to be as benign as the recent past if we're dealing with this blip or a strategic inflection point? And that takes me to the second thing I need to discuss, and it's probably a more technical point, is that we can clearly identify where the iterative post-Cold War reductions in defense capability have now taken us. So we know about numbers, and this isn't just a UK point, this is an alliance point. So numbers, manpower, equipment, sustainability, the reductions in the way armed forces train, certainly train collectively at scale. And why wouldn't you do that if you didn't feel threatened? And reversing that, or even just marginally changing it, has policy implications and is clearly expensive. So you want to do it for good reasons, but maybe we should discuss whether those reasons are starting to exist if you can't guarantee how the future turns out. So my sense there is, and I've used this rather clumsy term, declining emulation, and I wish I could find a better term, where over the passage of the last 20 years or so, we have reduced, because of the size of the budget and the costs of people and equipment, we've built smaller forces which are very good, so quality is commendable, and we aim, as the UK and other European nations, to contribute to the bigger forces others have. But if you're on that scale, there must come a point where the forces that you field are looking like tokenism and over-reliant on other big spenders. And that wouldn't matter, of course, if the future was guaranteed to be as benign as the recent past. So again, it's a technical argument, but we live with armed forces in Europe that have applied the approach of graduated readiness, where only an element of the force is held ready at any one particular time, and the costs of bringing the full force to full readiness are generally being depleted, so you're not even sure you could do that, and there's not been the imperative to do it. But some of you in this room are old enough to remember the Cold War, where the whole force is mobilizable very quickly. So are we comfortable with that if the future is not necessarily as benign as the recent past? I also think the critical challenge perhaps is to question our thinking about what conflict looks like. So we may be guilty of templating our view of what war is like based on the experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that and the way that we tend or are tending to intervene in crises like Syria and Libya today. And some people want to call that the new normal. They are trying to assert that the only way the West will fight wars is on the template that you have seen rolled out over the last 20, 30 years. Discretionary, limited interventions abroad with the homeland not at risk. And we need to have this conversation with our NATO partners, because they have gone through the same business of demobilizing their national forces, and as an alliance, NATO looks very different, for very good reasons, from the alliance as it was in 1989. So forces withdrawn to national territories, smaller, much less effort in planning for things like Article 5 contingencies, as I say, a reduced scale in training, and that is all explicable. But in a world that is maybe changing, it also creates a gap where you may have an awful lot of stuff in theory in the NATO alliance, but it's held at a level of relatively low readiness. And there may be others in the world who have other ambitions, who are investing differently, who, though they have smaller forces and less overall resource, they're better organized and readier, and you've created a scope for miscalculation and opportunism. And I think we should talk about that particular risk. And we also need to talk about what do we mean by conflict. And I come back to this business of templating thinking as a result of what happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, and what is now happening in the way we provide this sort of corporate support in places like Libya, with planning and training and equipment and logistics and precision firepower, but not boots on the ground and not intending really to be decisive. Because our experience of conflict, quite comfortable, arguably, it's absolutely not the experience of the population of Syria. It's absolutely not what you see in the language that's exchanged between North and South Korea. It's absolutely not the potential for miscalculation that you see in the East and South China Sea. So whatever we're used to and whatever we would prefer, I think we need to discuss whether we are building forces and establishing readiness and conducting planning and training against the right benchmarks. Because it is clear that whilst we've been doing the things that we've been doing, conflict has continued to change. Method has changed. I don't think necessarily there's anything new, but there's greater variety. So you will have talked about hybrid conflict, war in the grey space. You can see the careful investment in things like area denial and anti-access capability that is a deterrent to the full capability of Western armed forces and others. You understand the role that cyber plays at all levels now as just a normal part of competition, confrontation, and conflict between nations and indeed within nations. But if our template is about what we did in Iraq or Afghanistan, what we're now doing in Syria, and we choose not to regard the potential for a different sort of confrontation with people we're not getting on that well with, like Russia, are we organized to play in the grey space, to be effective in hybrid conflict, to deal with new method, and are we organized to deal with the emergence of new capabilities? I've mentioned cyber, but the age of conventional ballistic missiles has profound implications for the security of the homeland, for things like critical national infrastructure, for the safety and security of large platforms and installations on deployed operations abroad. And that's not something that's ever featured in recent operations or indeed in some of our capability planning. So if method and capability are changing and we need to question what conflict looks like, if you bundle all of that together in a discussion, would we arrive at a different set of benchmarks against which to calibrate Western European armed forces, not just the UK? And in doing that, and this plays to the title of today, it is evident that we all exist in the foothills of the information age. So even if you note the changes that have taken place so far, many, many people in many walks of life are beginning to tell us how the way we live, how we work, how we play is going to change profoundly as we move through this information age. And of course, there's no agreed definition of what the information age actually is. So for some people, it's just social media, apparently. So it's just Twitter. For others, it's just cyber, and cyber is only about tinkering in other people's networks. And that will take us down a blind alley. So I think what we need to talk about is a whole span of individual technologies which individually will change the way in the military and security arena you conceive, design, build, and operate capability. And these individual technologies would of course include data processing and connectivity, so big data, Internet of Things, but also artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, robotics, materials, nanotechnology, the commercial use of space, and virtual reality. And there are probably in this room, and I think based on the list there are, individuals in these technologies. So you can find a reasonable number of people now who understand big data and understand its commercial application. And you can see that changing life. So Uber, Amazon, the Google car, machine trading in the city in fractions of a second. So we can see that happening in individual technology. That's not the discussion that I think we need to have. We need to have this discussion about the combinations of those technologies, because that's where you could build a new military competitive edge. So specifically, data, so the cloud, connectivity that comes with the Internet of Things, where you connect machines to machines and everybody to everybody, and robotics. So there are, I think, some encouraging tentative first steps in this, in the military lane. So the Royal Navy are going to have Unmanned Warrior, I think it's next month, development from Predator to Scavenger, the advent of 77 Brigade, the work that in Joint Forces Command, Joint Force Development are doing on the whole business of warfare in the information age. But actually, many of this will be the military following civil best practice, because that's where the investment is and the greater expertise is. And it implies, therefore, a partnership between the military, and we need to have this on an alliance basis, and civil society. And there are people who are uncomfortable with that idea of a partnership. They're going to say the mercenary word sooner or later, and that's a great shame. But the fact is, this is a whole-of-nation effort, I think. So here's the big thought, that if we look at our current predicament in the world and we question how benign it's going to be, if we look at our current defense model and if we were to take the view that perhaps this is a frog that has boiled, And then we're going to take the view that maybe just some minor tweaks aren't going to be enough, and there's little nips and tucks here to embellish the current defence model across NATO with a little bit of information data. If that's not going to be enough, then we need a better, richer discussion. And then we'd have to ask ourselves, well, who's going to do this? Because I don't think there's any one organisation that is big enough, knowledgeable enough, powerful enough, or rich enough to identify those combinations of information age technology that would restore the competitive edge at an affordable price in Western armed forces, that would allow us to counter the advantages in mass and perhaps ruthlessness and ambition that other potential opponents may have in the future. And I'm not for a minute suggesting that we are going to be at war this afternoon. What I am suggesting is if the future is going to be different, we should have a discussion now and reorder ourselves in good time, rather than wait for something terrible to happen. So, that's the proposition. Is there a route through early exploitation and adoption of all the information age technology, through clever combinations, that would transform militaries are equipped and operate, that would restore at an acceptable price the competitive edge which we may judge is eroding, and we might need to do that because we sense that the future going ahead is more threatening, and our current defence model, rooted in the comfortable passage of the recent past, isn't going to cut it in the future. Let's at least have a discussion about that.